Ah, okay.
Okay, colleagues, please take your seats. We'll start immediately. Thank you. So the 8th meeting of the 63rd session of the Commission for Social Development is called to order. I invite Commission to continue its consideration of the agenda item 3A, entitled Priority Theme, Strengthening Solidarity, Social Inclusion and Social Cohesion, to accelerate the delivery of the commitments of the Copenhagen Declaration of Social Development and Programme of Action of the World Social Summit for Social Development, as well as the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, in order to hold an interactive dialogue with senior officials of the United Nations system entitled Preparation for the World Social Summit, under the title The Second World Summit for Social Development. I'm now pleased to welcome the distinguished panelists of our interactive dialogue with the senior UN officials. Madame Rola Dashti, Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia. Welcome. Ms. Laura Thompson, Assistant Director General for the External and Corporate Relations at the ILO, speaking on behalf of Mr. Gilbert Hungbu, Director General of ILO. Welcome. Madam Magdalena Sepulveda Carmona, Director of the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development, UNSRI. Welcome. And Mr. Sarinvas Tata, Director of the Social Development Division of the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and Pacific, speaking on behalf of Madam Armida Salisa Alishan-Bana, Executive Director of the ESCAP, and Mr. Rodrigo Martinez, Senior Officer of the Social Development Division at the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and Caribbean, ECLAC, speaking on behalf of the Executive Secretary of the ECLAC. And I want to inform the Commission that last-minute obligations prevented Mr. Claver Gatete, the Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Africa, to join us today. We will try to hope to join the Africa Commission later during the discussion, because I just want to inform the Commission that we have not left Africa aside in this debate. It's just circumstances that prevented Mr. Gatete from joining us. And I'm also pleased to welcome the moderator, well-known Mr. Navid Hainif, Assistant Secretary General for Economic Development at the Department of Economic and Social Affairs. Welcome. Mr. Hanif, you have the floor.
Mr. Chairman, Ambassador Sheresky, thank you so much for the opportunity to moderate this panel discussion with senior officials from the United Nations, and I'm honored to be part of this distinguished panel. Members who I'm sure will give us their very rich perspectives, but also insightful ideas how to advance social development. So as moderator, you want to subject yourself to the same task that you want the panelists to give. Be brief, be sharp, be focused. So I asked myself, if I were to describe in one word the state of social development in the last 30 years, since Copenhagen, one word, because it's a very challenging environment where you seek attention from people. So I would say, in one word, it's good. Poverty was 26%, and now it's 8.5%. 5 or 6%. We have much better understanding of social development data than we did 30 years ago. We also have better analytical work, both in terms of micro-interventions and macro policy shifts that give us better social outcomes. So the state of play looks good. But then I asked myself, if I were to describe it in 2 words, it's not good. It's not good because inequalities are rising. Too many people have been left behind. If we continue on the current trajectory, around 300 million people will still be living in poverty by 2030. It's not good because if you look at the gender goals agreed in the SDGs, the targets, it will take us around 186 years to achieve those targets. So this was a test that I put to myself. Then I went to artificial intelligence and ran a search on state of social development. The answers I got were not surprising, but stunning. So the AI responds to me, state of social development, improved access to basic services. Of course, we had good economic growth in the last 30 years and poverty reduction. Over 1 billion people came out of absolute poverty. But persistent challenges the AI gave me, just look at the list. Widening inequalities, impact of global crises, changing demographics and urbanization, technological disruptions, climate change, and environmental degradation. So aggregates and averages are misleading. That's why we have brought together this panel. They will provide us perspectives from each region, from institutions like ILO and UNRISD, who have a very different take on these analytical work streams that the UN pursues. So today, the panel is meant to give you a multidimensional view of social development, and at the same time, multidimensional interventions that will eventually improve the state of social development globally. So what we're expecting today from our panelists, not only give us the update in their regions, in their areas of expertise, on what we have accomplished since Copenhagen 30 years ago, but what needs to be done, because 8 SDGs out of 17 are dealing with social development. As all of you know, we have only been on track on the 17% of the targets, and they're not mostly social targets. They're targets from the digitalization and other areas. So with those comments, I want to invite our first speaker, the Executive Secretary of ESQUA, Ms. Rola Darti. She is coming from a region which is facing very serious challenges on social development and on peace and security. So, Ms. Darti, please give us your assessment of social development indicators in your region since Copenhagen, since the adoption of the 2030 agenda, and what are your suggestions, solutions that we can advance in the next 7 to 8 months for the World Summit on Social Development that will be held in Doha in November this year. So I've been asked to give you just 6 minutes, but you could have extra 2 minutes because one of the speakers is not joining us. But give us, please, ideas how to advance social development in your part of the world. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Naveed. One thing is clear from what Naveed has mentioned is that the world is at an inflection point. The challenges mentioned, poverty, hunger, employment, inequality, and social inclusion, are evolving in ways that demand a fundamental shift in how we think about solutions. The Arab region illustrates this urgency in stark terms. Conflict, economic instability, climate stress, and digital transformation are reshaping the social landscape. And unless we act with foresight, the gaps we seek to close will only deepen. Over the past months, ESCO has engaged extensively with our member states to identify key priorities for the Second World Summit for Social Development. The League of Arab States, in collaboration with ESCO and other UN entities, will convene governments in April to adopt a unified regional position, ensuring the Arab voice is strong, strategic, and solution-driven. But governments alone cannot define this agenda. Through the Arab Sustainable Development Forum, we are engaging civil societies, think tanks, youth, and vulnerable groups to ensure that the priorities shaping the summit reflect the needs and experiences of those affected by today's development challenges. One of the central questions posed is, what priorities have emerged from these consultations? From the Arab region, 4 key themes must shape the summit's outcomes. First, social development cannot be addressed without recognizing the structural barriers created by conflict and instability. Today, nearly 40% of the Arab population lives in conflict-affected countries, and the humanitarian needs have surged with more than 70 million people requiring assistance. This is not just a crisis of displacement. It is a development crisis. When conflict-affected countries show regressions in nearly all SDG indicators, we must move beyond reactive responses. Social policies must be designed for resilience, ensuring that humanitarian assistance aligns with national social protection systems, improving recipient tracking for more effective resource allocation, and strengthening early warning systems to detect crises before they escalate. ESCO is already supporting governments in these areas, but the summit must push for a global framework that embeds conflict-sensitive development planning into broader social policies. Employment remains at the heart of social development, but the assumption that economic growth will automatically create decent jobs is no longer valid. The Arab region faces a growing divide between the skills needed for emerging industries and those currently being developed through the education systems. In addition, debt levels in the region reached about $1.6 trillion in 2023, constraining public investments in education and workforce development. The summit must push for policies that ensure the availability of decent jobs, the accessibility of skills training, and the sustainability of employment sectors that are resistant to economic and technological disruptions. This means prioritizing lifelong learning, aligning education with future job markets, and expanding investments in digital and green industries. ESCO is already working with governments to integrate skills forecasting into policy planning, but this must be part of a global effort to ensure employment policies are fit for the future. At the same time, intergenerational equity must be central to the political declaration. Social and economic policies cannot disproportionately benefit one generation while constraining opportunities for another. The Arab region is undergoing demographic shifts that require new approaches to workforce participation, retirement security, and knowledge transfer. Ensuring sustainable pension systems, fostering mentorship between older and younger workers, and preventing rising debt burdens from limiting future generations' development prospects are very critical. The political declaration must recognize these linkages and promote policies that enable all generations to contribute meaningfully to social and economic progress. Technology and digital transformation present another major opportunity, but only if managed inclusively. The digital divide in the Arab region remains significant. In 2024, 75% of men had internet access, compared to 64% of women. And while urban areas have an access rate of 83%, it drops to 50% in rural communities. The summit must push for digital inclusion policies that go beyond expanding infrastructure, ensuring that digital services are affordable, that digital skills training is accessible, and that regulations promote equity rather than reinforce exclusion. ESCWA is actively supporting this agenda, strengthening regional AI governance, expanding the use of big data in policymaking, and developing strategies for upskilling and reskilling workers in the digital economy. Another issue that has resurfaced repeatedly in consultations is the intersection of climate and social development. The Arab region is already experiencing the consequences of environmental degradation, with water scarcity, rising temperature, and extreme weather events driving displacement and deepening inequalities. Yet, climate policies are often disconnected from social policies. The summit must change this by embedding just transition principles into climate action, ensuring that green policies also create jobs, strengthen local economies, and expand access to sustainable resources. This is not just about climate adaptation. It's about making sure climate action is a driver of inclusive social development. A final question raised is, what future contributions are planned leading up to the summit? ESCWA is committed to ensuring that the priorities of the region are fully integrated into the global agenda. In addition to our engagement with the League of Arab States, we are mobilizing intergovernmental processes, including the Arab Forum of Equality and expert working groups, to refine and amplify policy recommendations. The Arab Sustainable Development Forum will serve as a critical space to integrate perspectives from civil societies, ensuring that the summit's discussions are not limited to governments, but reflect the priorities of people and communities. This brings me to the final question. How do we ensure that the summit's political declaration translates into real progress? The success of the summit will not be measured by the ambition of its words, but by the strength of its commitments. The political declaration must go beyond reaffirming principles. It must provide a roadmap for action with measurable targets, accountability frameworks, and mechanisms for global cooperation. It must reinforce the linkages between World Social Summit Development 2, Financing for Development, the Pact for the Future, and COP30, ensuring that commitments made in one arena support and accelerate progress in another. ESCWA is already working to ensure that these processes are connected, advocating for a regional approach that integrates social development into broader economic and environmental strategies. The Arab region is fully engaged in shaping this agenda and will continue to do that. And as we move forward toward the summit, we are committed to translate our priorities into concrete, actionable outcomes. The Second World Summit for Social Development presents a unique opportunity to reset global priorities and build a more inclusive, resilient, and sustainable future. We must ensure that commitments made at this summit are not just aspirational, but operational, accountable, and transformative, ensuring that the political declaration reflects real priorities, and lays the groundwork for meaningful action. Thank you, Navid.
Thank you, Ms. Sarthi, for your very sharply focused intervention, and the way you have responded to the questions will be very helpful in developing ideas for the summit to pursue. Thank you. Let me now invite our next speaker, Ms. Laura Thompson. Actually, she's speaking on behalf of the head of ILO, Mr. Gilbert Ungbo, and I think Ms. Laura Thompson has been an active advocate for social justice, running that coalition. So, and ILO's traditional approach on social issues has always given UN a compass in pursuing these objectives. So let me invite Ms. Thompson to share with us ideas from the Coalition for Social Justice and your vision for the second summit on social development. Over to you.
Thank you, Assistant Director General, and good morning, everybody. And thanks for the invitation to the DG that unfortunately could not be here. This second World Summit for Social Development is really of high importance for the ILO and for our constituents. As was the first summit in 1995, it is also, as a follow-up to the Copenhagen Summit, that the ILO decent work agenda, and everybody talks about decent jobs today, was created, and that the tripartite declaration on fundamental principles and rights at work, a landmark, the declaration for the multilateral system, was adopted in 1998. In today's challenging multilateral context, the ILO stands ready to support the adoption of an ambitious political declaration by all heads of state at the second summit. Our contribution is part of the support that the UN system provides through the UN Interagency Task Force under the leadership of the Deputy Secretary General. In line with the modality resolution adopted by the GA, our collective ambition is to boost social development and accelerate the achievement of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. The ILO is a tripartite organization involving governments, usually labor ministries, workers and employers organizations, and the ILO's contribution to the summit is a tripartite contribution. So far, our governing body has issued key messages addressed to the summit. We expect a resolution to be adopted next June by the International Labour Conference, which is the ILO's highest decision-making body. The key messages that were adopted by the governing body last November stress the importance for the summit to address social development challenges in the context of global transformations. And my predecessor talked about some of them. The world of work is really going through important structural changes induced by the global trends such as technological innovation, including AI, climate change, demographic shifts, and geopolitical tensions, among many others. If left unaddressed, these transformations are very likely to widen inequalities, enhance economic insecurity, increase the risk of social unrest, and further erode the trust in institutions. The summit is therefore, for us, an opportunity to advance a collective and inclusive response to the challenges and opportunities that are created by these global trends. Against this backdrop, the ILO's governing body calls for a renewed global social contract to manage these transformations with a human-centered approach. Renewing the global social contract is not about setting social policy prescriptions, but it is rather an invitation to all member states to uphold the social justice principles on which the ILO was founded and strengthen the social dimension of sustainable development in a rapidly evolving global environment. One of the key priority areas concerns the impact of artificial intelligence and digitalization in the world of work. Technological innovations create both challenges and opportunities. monitoring their impact and optimizing their potential for decent work creation is critical, and the ILO is ready to play its part and work with other UN organizations, international financial institutions, and other partners. Our recently created Observatory on AI and Decent Work in the Digital Economy can play an important role in this regard. A second priority area concerns the human resilience to a disrupted environment, including climate change and biodiversity loss. Drought, flooding, or depletion of natural resources hit more severely the most vulnerable populations, and this calls for responsive social protection systems. Yet today, 3.8 billion people, that is over 48% of the world population, have no access to social protection. And in the 20 countries that are most vulnerable to the climate crisis, 91% still lack any form of social protection. The ILO advocates for universal social protection and stands ready to support member states in achieving their SDG-related targets with the support of a multilateral system that enables the necessary fiscal space. A third priority area concerns youth employment. Today, 1 in 5 young persons in the world is neither in employment, in education, or in training. The rate is almost 26% for young women. This is a personal drama for the young persons concerned, but also a waste of assets for national development plans and a missed opportunity for countries with labor market shortages. The consequences of this waste of talent go much beyond the world of work. The ILO therefore recommends the summit to agree on concrete commitments aimed at lowering youth unemployment in line with each country's circumstances. To conclude, Navid, let me highlight the recent created Global Coalition for Social Justice that you mentioned just before. With its 330 partners, including governments, international and regional organizations, employers and workers' organizations, businesses, international NGOs, and academia, the coalition is ideally positioned to galvanize multi-stakeholders' cooperation towards the realization of the outcomes of the summit in a coherent manner. And I use the opportunity to thank you, Endesa, for the leadership in the coalition, but also the regional commissions that are all members of the coalition. We are hoping that we can bring responses to the summit in a coherent manner with this large participation. So I invite all of you to join the coalition. Thank you.
Thank you, ASG Thompson, for your very clear priorities for the summit, and I want to commend ILO for launching the coalition on social justice, and I'm confident it will influence the summit's outcome in a meaningful fashion. Our next speaker, and I can really put her on the spot, you know, when you invite a think tank, you expect from them to break some china in the room. Because since we came up with the concept of sustainable development, social development remains the weakest pillar out of the three. The economic side, the environmental side grew since 1992 in terms of influence and advocacy and allocation of resources. This is one pillar which is within governments, is not strong in terms of influence, financial decisions, economic decisions, and globally also. We need to make sure the second summit on social development gives social development the pedestal it deserves in national policy making. Social outcomes should not be an afterthought. They should be central objectives of economic and financial policies. And that's where, and she's an activist also, Ms. Magdalena Carmona, who is the recently appointed director of UN Research Institute on Social Development, to give us bold and new ideas. How do we bring social outcomes at the center of policy making, globally and nationally? Ms. Carmona? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Chair. UNRWA, as the only UN institution dedicated to researching social dimension of development, is uniquely positioned to provide support to the preparation of the World Social Summit. UNRWA played already a very important role in 1995, and we are ready to continue to provide strong support to have a successful outcome of this second summit. As part of the work that we have been doing, we have developed global and regional consultation aimed to gather diverse perspective on pressing social development challenges and actionable solution. So I'm going to start by briefly describing the outcome of these consultations. I have to say that UNRWA has over 60 years of cutting-edge policy-applied research and a network of 20,000 experts. And with this, we have our capacity to convene stakeholders and shape evidence-based solutions. So let me first very briefly refer to the outcome of our global consultation. The total number of respondents as to February, the 6th of February, was 520 participants. It was near gender parity with 51% of women. And regarding the sectorial representation was 1/3 from academia and research, 1/3 from civil society organization, and 1/3 from government, UN agencies, and private sector. So what were these key challenges that this global consultation identified? First, and you have heard this from previous panelists, inequality. Persistent inequalities in wealth, income, and access to resources, according to the participants, remain a dominant challenge, with marginalized groups disproportionately affected. The second challenge was governance and political stability. Again, this has already been highlighted. Participants emphasized the need for more transparent and accountable institutions, as weak governance exacerbates social and economic challenges. Corruption and ineffective policies were identified as significant obstacles to progress. Third, climate change and environmental sustainability. Environmental degradation, including climate change and biodiversity loss, was widely recognized as a cross-cutting issue affecting livelihood, health, and equity. Fourth, employment and decent work. The lack of decent work opportunities, widespread informality, and job insecurity were highlighted as barriers to social inclusion and economic stability. And finally, poverty and social exclusion, in particular in rural areas and informal economies. The global survey also identified 5 policy demands. These were accountable and inclusive governance, universal social protection, education and youth empowerment, particularly those that equip youth with the skills for emerging economic sector and the future world of work, was highlighted as essential for long-term development, climate resilience and sustainability, and equitable economic system. We've also carried out 4 regional consultations, and I am delighted to provide some of the complete briefing outcomes that are available at the entrance. These consultations were in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the ones that we have the access to the information now. In Africa, informality, lack of social protection and labor rights, youth unemployment, gender inequality, and climate change were considered the major challenges. In Asia, the regional consultation identified that the region faced significant structural challenges, including a digital divide, aging population, and climate-related risk. In Latin America and the Caribbean region, again, informality was highlighted in the consultation: structural inequalities, backlash against progressive policies, weakened democratic governance, and climate change risk were those challenges most identified. Now, from the point of view of our research, we consider that the political declaration should include the following areas. First, extending the coverage and mobilizing resources towards universal, rights-based social protection systems to ensure access to adequate income across the life cycle and social assistance benefits for marginalized groups, include informal workers and migrants, as well as access to essential services like health, education, and care. Regarding gender justice, we also consider that the political declaration should recognize the need to implement care economy reforms to recognize, reduce, and redistribute unpaid care work, including the expansion of childcare services and support to caregivers. It is also important to recognize the need to have a gender-focused climate resilience, as climate change is disproportionately impacting women and girls. It is also clear from our research that there is the need to recognize the transition to inclusive and sustainable economic system that prioritize well-being, caregiving, and community support over extractive practices. We need to foster innovative framework for community-driven cooperatives and sustainable production systems that prioritize equity and environmental health. We need to move beyond GDP as the sole indicator of success, focusing instead on measures like well-being, equity, and environmental sustainability. It is also important to address the issues of just transition. The political declaration should include a commitment by states to identify pathways to a future independent of fossil fuel production, ensuring that the just transition do not exacerbate inequalities and that the cost and benefits are fairly distributed. Finally, it will also be important to recognize the need for multilateral action. Multilateral systems are vital for addressing global challenges such as inequality, environmental crisis, and instability. International cooperation must foster solidarity, equitable resource sharing, and coordinated policy action to accelerate the transformations at all levels. Finally, let me conclude by stressing that the political declaration should contain concrete follow-up mechanism, including post-summit regular meetings, data collection, and analytical reports monitoring progress. National and international civil society actors and the general public should be able to hold their government to account on the commitments made in the political declaration. They should be able to use the summit's outcomes for their advocacy at the national level. Finally, to achieve an ambitious political declaration in this difficult time of polarization, we would like to make a call to all stakeholders to maximize their impact by continue to building alliance across regional groups with international organizations, academia, and civil society. Let's arrive to Qatar with an ambitious agenda that address the social challenges of our time once and for all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Carmona, for sharing with us for very comprehensive outcome of your consultations and very specific ideas for Summit to pursue. Let me go to our next speaker, Mr. Srinivas Tata. He is Director of Social Development Division at the Economic Commission for the Asia and the Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, and he will give us his perspectives on the challenges of social development in the Asia-Pacific region. Mr. Tata, you have the microphone.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. And also I'd like to thank the Bureau of the Commission for inviting ESCAP to be part of this panel. Let me start by stressing why the Copenhagen Declaration is so important for us, especially in the regions. Adopted in 1995, it has long served as a guiding framework for multilateral cooperation on social development. The Copenhagen Declaration places people at the heart of development, and with a focus on eradicating poverty, fostering full and productive employment, and promoting social inclusion as the key pillars. The Declaration highlights the interdependence of economic development, social advancement, and environmental protection as essential elements of sustainable progress. And it recognizes the importance of regional frameworks for social development, and in 1995 had the vision to request the regional commissions to regularly evaluate progress made towards fulfilling the outcomes of the summit. As far as the second summit is concerned, Mr. Moderator, ESCAP is contributing to the preparations by organizing multi-stakeholder consultations. We started last year in the form of a special event at the margins of the ESCAP's Committee on Social Development, where there was a brainstorming session involving member states, CSOs, academia, to highlight some of the key priorities for the region. It also set the agenda for a multi-stakeholder consultations which is being held back-to-back with the Asia-Pacific Forum for Sustainable Development on the 24th of February 2025. It's being organized by the entire UN system at the regional level, and the discussions will be focused around 4 roundtables focusing on decent work and employment, demographic change, including aging, youth and migration, social protection, gender, governance, and partnerships, all of which have been touched upon by the previous speakers. We hope that we will get truly integrated solutions and suggestions to inform the global discussions. Now, let me focus on some of the key issues that have emerged in the discussions, both during the special event and as part of a number of other intergovernmental meetings on social development, all of which have a direct relevance for the issues which will be discussed in the World Social Summit. The first is the rapid demographic change that has swept the Asia-Pacific region since 1995. About 4.8 billion people, or 58% of the global population, reside in Asia and the Pacific. This population is expected to peak in 2051 and start declining to about 4.4 billion by 2100. Population growth is slowing, with some countries already experiencing declines. The region is undergoing a demographic transition which is unprecedented towards smaller and older populations, with the number of older persons, 65 years or above, expected to nearly double from 500 million in 2024 to almost 1 billion in 2050. This population aging presents challenges to countries. We know in terms of lower economic growth, declining productivity, and increasing health and overall care needs. Moreover, given the level of social and economic development in the region, older persons are often at the risk to be left behind in terms of social protection, health, and overall well-being. Yet, there are many countries in the region which are still having a youth bulge. And so we also need to pay specific attention to the needs of the youth, who are also present in large numbers in the region. So this rapid demographic transition requires a focus on something that's been highlighted by some of our previous speakers, which is intergenerational solidarity. This intergenerational relations are expressed in many ways, including through living arrangement, consumption and production patterns, economic activity, climate change responses, caregiving, lifelong learning, and technological use. This should be one of the central parts for discussion when we come to the second World Summit on Social Development. Across many parts of Asia-Pacific, poverty remains an unfinished agenda, and the progress made in reducing monetary poverty in recent decades was undone by the COVID-19 pandemic and the ongoing cost of living crisis. It is estimated that an additional 42 million people in the region were pushed into extreme poverty in 2022 compared with the pre-pandemic levels based on the $2.15 poverty line. Inequality has also been rising in Asia Pacific, as we have heard from previous speakers, so has it been in a number of other regions. According to the World Inequality Database, Gini coefficient for income ranged between 0.36 and 0.64 in the region in 2023, with an average of 0.55. Income inequality has grown in the period 2019 to 2022 compared to the period 2000 to 2019. So we really suffered during the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, previous speakers have also talked about the importance of relating climate change and the impact it has on social development. The increasing prevalence of extreme climate events affects all households, but especially those which are already vulnerable and marginalized. Many existing hotspots of climate-related multi-hazards are forecast to expand or intensify as new hotspots emerge. People who reside in these hotspots, often already poor with limited access to infrastructure, will be exposed to more frequent and intense sudden onset natural disasters. Remember that they will also be the first in line to be affected by slow onset climate change events, such as sea level rise, temperature change, drought, and the impacts of adaptation and mitigation policies to tackle climate change. We believe that strong social protection systems will be pivotal in ensuring inclusive, sustainable, and equitable development for all. However, in many countries in our region, fewer than 50% of the population are covered by any form of social protection. It's not that progress has not been made. In fact, the Asia-Pacific region has made slow but steady progress in implementing nationally appropriate social protection systems and measures for all by 2030, and to achieve substantial coverage of the poor and the vulnerable. Between 2016 and 2023, the region has advanced in extending coverage for major contingencies throughout the life cycle, including children, persons with disabilities, working age population, and older persons, consistent with the concept of a social protection floor. However, the biggest challenge is the informal economy. There are 1.3 billion informal workers in Asia Pacific, making up 2/3 of the employed population. A large number, the agriculture is the largest sector for informal work. And informality keeps people vulnerable without rights and access to social protection. Informality, in a way, leads to a vicious cycle whereby employed persons are unable to adhere to a contributory pension system, and end up in poverty in old age. Across the Asia-Pacific region, I would like to highlight that women are far less likely to participate in the labor force than men. In 2024, the regional gender gap in labor force participation stood at 30 percentage points, 73.6% for men, but only 43.9% for women aged 15 and above, a gap that has persisted since 1995. Many more young women and men in the region are not in employment, education, or training. When employed, women are often confined to precarious, informal, low-skilled, and labor-intensive work under unfavorable conditions. I would also like to share the earlier remarks that were made by my colleague from UNRISD and others about the disproportionate share of unpaid care work and domestic work performed by women and girls, which has been one of the biggest contributing factors to persistent gender inequalities in the region's labor market. I'd also like to identify the digital transformation as providing a great opportunity for reducing this, but provided it is really handled in a way that there is equitable access. Otherwise, it could be a new source of risk and vulnerability. Right now, fewer women than men use the internet, 63% to 69%, and there's wide gaps in internet usage and mobile phone ownership that exists between poorest and the wealthiest. This is using ESCAP's LNOB tool, which really draws upon data from individual countries. There's also a large gap between the less educated and the better educated. Data indicates that the gender gap is more evident when it comes to more advanced digital skills. Technical and vocational education and training and curricula need to be modernized to meet modern labor demands. in the context of the green and digital economies and the demographic shifts. I'd like to move towards the conclusion by drawing on some of the recommended policies and actions which are drawn from the facts that are presented in the earlier slides. But it is very clear that addressing these gaps in social development in Asia Pacific and I think globally requires an integrated approach that combines the legislative frameworks, adequate financing, ensures gender equality with stronger social protection systems. The intersectionality of challenges such as poverty and inequality must be recognized, and measures to address them through policies, programs, and action plans must be mainstreamed. This addressing of the intersectionality and adoption of the integrated approach could be one of the biggest value add of the forthcoming World Social Summit. We have great structured agendas addressing aging, social protection, a number of these areas, but the World Social Summit can really bring this all together and bring out the intersectionalities and address issues as often we know that economic, social, and environmental issues are deeply intertwined. I'd like to end with a set of questions that were raised that we expect the forthcoming Asia-Pacific multi-stakeholder consultation to address. How do we look beyond economic growth and recommit to social and environmental aspects of development additionally? How can governments strengthen the social protection system to ensure that people have income security and address the issue of the large income informal economy during economic and social transitions and disruptions? How are governments preparing for an aging population and harnessing opportunities to strengthen intergenerational solidarity? With increasing care demand in the regions, how can our policies be more gender responsive in terms of social protection and care policies? How can we ensure that we reduce poverty and inequality and create opportunities for all groups of societies? And last but not least, how can civil society and social partners, what is their role to help tackle structural barriers and social norms with a view to enable inclusive policy making and successful implementation of the policies? Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you, Mr. Tata, for your data-driven presentation with very solid arguments for action. And I'm sure these will influence the deliberations for the summit's preparations. But I think 2 points stand out for Asia, especially silver economy. Europe is already embracing that concept. Given the aging challenges in Asia Pacific, I think silver economy should also be a focus of the second Summit on Social Development. And temporal equity, not only spatial, but temporal fairness and equity are also critical if we want society to remain stable and sustain its growth and progress towards the SDGs. So thank you. Let me now invite our last speaker, last but not the least, Mr. Rodrigo Martinez, who is representing the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, and they have been an active participant in system-wide preparations for the second World Social Summit. Mr. Rod Martinez, over to you.
Thank you very much, Navid. I will talk in Spanish. I have a presentation. I don't know if it is. Yeah, okay. Estimados representantes y
distinguished representatives, colleagues, I bring a greeting, cordial greetings from José Manuel Salazar Cuninax. It's a pleasure for me to be able to share with you some elements of our work ahead of the second World Summit for Social Development, and explaining some main activities, documents, and messages from countries in the region. First, I would like to say in relation to activities, next slide please. There have been 7 events and 6 documents to summarize this process. First of all, we began with a mandate from the 5th session of the Regional Conference on Social Development of 2023 on October the 31st in Barbados. At the 6th meeting of the Board of Directors, where we presented an initial proposal with challenges, priorities, and messages ahead of the summit, with active participation from all countries. We supported the work of the G20 under the presidency of Brazil, and in particular with the task force, the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty, and with an analysis document and policy proposals to tackle social inequality in our region, which was presented at the G20 Social Summit in Rio de Janeiro in November last year. We also coordinated preparation of the document Road to the second summit of the World Summit on Social Development, contributions of the regional commissions. And ECLAC was responsible for coordinating this, but there was participation from all of the regional commissions. And in recent months, we responded to a request from the Bureau from the October meeting relating to activities to take place this year with a high level of participation, and working with Chile, current chair of the regional conference, and also Brazil, also future chair. This document includes a set of proposals from the Ministries of Social Development to advance in inclusive social development, and will be discussed on the 24th of March at a special meeting of the Board of Directors of the Regional Conference on Social Development, and it will be officially presented on the 1st of April at the high-level summit on the road to the Second World Summit for Social Development of the Sustainable Development Forum to take place in Santiago. On that occasion, the policy brief, Latin America and the Caribbean, ahead of the Second World Summit for Social Development, proposals for inclusive social development, will be presented. This document summarizes the idea of a pact at the global level arising from experiences at a national and regional level on social policy. On the 14th and 15th of May, we have a seminar scheduled with the IDB in Guatemala to discuss social inequality challenges in the region. And then, from the 24th of June to the 26th of June, we will hold the 5th regional seminar on social development, entitled The Road to the Second World Summit for Social Development, Priorities for Inclusive Social Development in Latin America and the Caribbean. It will be a hybrid meeting with UN officials, academics, and others to discuss the pitfalls to be avoided in the development and transformations that are needed to address high inequality, low social cohesion and mobility, as well as structural and emerging risks in the region, including many of the people who are here today. Then from the 2nd of September to the 6th of September, we will be holding the 6th Regional Conference on Social Development in Brasilia. This is the last preparatory meeting, and ministers will receive a summary of information, including an analysis of the regional situation 30 years after the Copenhagen Summit, and we will share views on proposals made, and this will the whole process will culminate with our participation in the Second World Summit in Qatar. The messages covered in the 6 documents converge on the idea of a pact for inclusive social development, an instrument aligned with the Pact for the Future to achieve the SDG targets most closely linked to the social dimension of the 2030 Agenda. The proposal is the outcome of a process initiated in 2015 with countries of the region, where we defined inclusive social development, which we understand to be the stage at which all people achieve a life free of poverty and a level of well-being in line with the level of economic growth of society, allowing them to develop their activities in freedom and dignity with full exercise of their economic, social, cultural and environmental rights, which are guaranteed, and where they have spaces for recognition and participation. As we said in Barbados, social inclusion and inclusion in the labour market are 2 dimensions that are fundamental and complementary to inclusive social development. The first, together with exercise of rights, participation and recognition, and the second on employability and inclusion in decent work. The 3rd meeting of the Regional Conference on Social Development, held in Mexico, has highlighted 4 axes and 56 lines of action to achieve the social targets under Agenda 2030. And when we look at this today, these all continue to be very valid in these fora. thinking about the Pact for the Future and the various other agreements and proposals, we're starting to see the idea of a Pact for Inclusive Social Development taking shape. Some important elements for consideration include prioritizing the following. Firstly, poverty and hunger. And these are two persistent but surmountable scourges. Inequality in its multiple dimensions represents a trap for development. This is expressed both in terms of disparities in income and also in the exercise of rights, as well as the gaps that are emerging with the great transformations taking place in the world today. Some public policies that we would highlight that should be crucial in the conversation, some of these have already been mentioned today, and these include universal social protection systems with full comprehensive coverage and that are financially sustainable and resilient to emerging crises and challenges at a global and regional level. These include comprehensive care systems and effectively take account of the care economy, and they should also strengthen public transfer programs as well as non-contribution-based pension rights. Secondly, labour inclusion, employability in the labour market, in decent working conditions, education to improve inclusion and mobility among youth, universal health systems with an emphasis on primary health care and prevention, housing and urbanisation to expand access to energy, water and sanitation, digital inclusion following the Global Digital Compact on access and use, while addressing the needs of different populations in terms of data security and protection. And policies to support social cohesion, recognition and participation. These should deal with the various different expressions of violence and how they impact the population. And to make progress in these areas, we believe that it is fundamental to have the following as a basis: a comprehensive analysis with a multidimensional index to measure inequality, with a metric including multiple criteria for decision-making at the public and private levels, including the 3 dimensions of sustainable development, not just efficiency. Secondly, strengthening social institutions in terms of their legal and normative dimensions, organizational, technical, operational and financial dimensions as well. Financial sustainability with spending standards to make policies feasible for the eradication of poverty in various countries. And we also must have multilateral cooperation with the active participation and cooperation of agencies of the international financial institutions, public-private sector, to ensure it's sustainable. We hope that these elements that stem from our work with the countries in the region will make it possible to achieve the highest possible commitments during the Second World Summit on Social Development to allow us to achieve effective progress towards fulfilling the goals set in the 2030 Agenda and those expressed in the Pact for the Future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rodrigo, for very detailed presentation with specific proposals for the summit to pursue. And coming from your region, these are certainly very relevant to addressing the challenges of inequality and job creation. So, distinguished delegates, we have 20 minutes for interactive discussion. We'll open the floor for your questions, comments to the panel. But I'm not putting anyone on the spot. As all of you know, Mr. Gatete could not join due to a last-minute call by some official that he had to join. I would really welcome delegates from Africa to bring the African perspective to this conversation, because when it comes to poverty, hunger, job creation, youth challenges, Africa's challenges are very visible and at times they look very difficult to solve. So I would really welcome the delegates from Africa to give their perspective for the World Summit on Social Development, and also not only raise concerns but provide solutions that they would like the leaders to adopt in addressing the challenges of Africa. So I have a list of speakers. We'll start with the Philippines, followed by Zimbabwe. The Philippines has the microphone. Please, I would request you to ask questions or make brief points. Kindly do not deliver national statements. It's an interactive conversation with the panelists. Thank you. The Philippines, please.
Excellencies, in 1994, the Philippines hosted the Asia and Pacific Ministerial Conference in preparation for the World Social Summit. This was done in partnership with the UN ESCAP. The conference adopted the Manila Declaration on the Agenda for Action on Social Development. It marked the region's strong commitment to advancing social justice and human well-being and shaping the global dialogue at the World Summit for Social Development in Copenhagen in 1995. The Philippines is pleased to once again engage the UN through this important dialogue as we prepare for the Second World Summit for Social Development. For the Philippines, social development is not just a policy goal. It guides the work of the government and stakeholders towards sustainable development that is rights-based, inclusive, and resilient. Our experience highlights three key priorities that we believe should shape the global agenda for the upcoming summit. First is strengthening social protection. Social protection must go beyond safety nets. It must be transformative and adaptive. However, as global challenges evolve, so must our response. The Philippines is now expanding adaptive social protection mechanisms integrating climate resilience, digital cash transfers, and labor market linkages to better support families in crisis, displaced communities, and informal sector workers. We are strengthening the adaptive and shock-responsive social protection mechanisms, particularly for informal workers, indigenous peoples, and climate-displaced communities. The UN OCHA is an important partner in implementing our humanitarian to development programs. Second is ensuring decent work and economic inclusion. Economic development cannot be sustained without social equity. Our focus should also include expanding economic opportunities for marginalized sectors, including women, youth, and persons with disabilities. We urge the UN and international financial institutions to invest in decent work, social entrepreneurship, and labor rights as key pillars of social development. Work is more than just a means of survival. It is a pathway to dignity, empowerment, and social mobility. A society that ensures decent work for all fosters not just economic growth, but also equity, resilience, and long-term prosperity. Third is advancing human capital development and social inclusion. Investing in people remains our greatest strategy for development. The Philippines is committed to universal healthcare, quality education, and gender-responsive policies to ensure that no one is left behind. We are strengthening policies such as the Magna Carta of Women and the expanded Senior Citizens Act, recognizing that inclusive development must leave no one behind. As we prepare for the World Social Summit, the Philippines calls for a renewed global social impact, one that prioritizes people over profit. We must commit to concentrate actions in achieving a just, equitable, and sustainable world. UN country teams should work with governments to advance the latter's development priorities and maximize impact on the ground. Maraming salamat at mabuhay.
Thank you, Undersecretary, for your statement from the Philippines. Next speaker is Zimbabwe, followed by the European Union. Zimbabwe.
Thank you very much, Chair. The Second World Summit for Social Development in Doha presents a crucial opportunity to build on the achievements of the past 30 years since Copenhagen. It is imperative that we focus on reaffirming and accelerating commitments to poverty reduction, full employment, and social integration in a rapidly evolving global landscape. At the core of this effort should be the provision of decent work, universal social protection, and sustainable social development. as fundamental pillars for socio-economic transformation. We must ensure that all people, especially those furthest behind, are protected against poverty, vulnerability, and exclusion throughout their life course from womb to tomb. This requires comprehensive income support, access to essential services, and protection against life risks. Secondly, recognizing social protection as a basic human right. It is critical that we take concrete and practical measures to enhance social security and social care systems, ensuring that no one is left behind. This demands adequate and sustainable financing for social development in line with the commitments made at Copenhagen. Additionally, we must tackle the root causes of slowed or reversed progress in social development, including economic inequalities, global crises, and structural barriers that undermine social justice and inclusion. No country can achieve these goals alone. We commend the collaborative efforts of the UN system, acknowledging that almost every UN agency has a mandate rooted in social development. The UN remains the most practical and universally accepted platform for advancing multilateral efforts in this regard. We therefore urge all UN agencies to play an active role in supporting governments, each within their respective areas of expertise, to drive progress towards the social development goals outlined in the 2030 Agenda and beyond. Finally, we add our voice to the call for flexible, predictable, and sustainable funding for UN agencies, enabling them to respond swiftly and effectively to social development challenges on the ground. Such funding mechanisms are critical to ensuring that the UN remains fit for purpose, capable of delivering its mandates, and fully equipped to support member states in achieving transformative social development outcomes. I thank you.
Thank you, Excellency, for your statement. The European Union, followed by Chile.
Thank you very much. Excellencies, I don't have a statement as much as it's more a reaction of what was said in the panel and a couple of questions. So I have two points. First, I would like to follow up to what one of the distinguished panel mentioned and ask about the role of stakeholders and civil society in the process. So we believe that the political declaration of the World Social Summit should reflect contribution from a broad representation of civil society, including youth representatives, persons with disabilities, people experiencing poverty, indigenous peoples, and all other relevant stakeholders. Because civil society organizations play a very important role complementary to the fight against poverty and social inclusion. Their dedicated activities can support public authorities in design and implementation of inclusion and activation policies. By providing both material and psychosocial support to the most vulnerable, civil society organizations contribute to restoring human dignity and supporting social inclusion, while at the same time guiding those who can work on their way to employment. Relevant stakeholders such as regional and local authorities, social partners, civil society organizations, social economy actors, and others should be empowered with a view to their effective participation in design, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation of social protection schemes. And taking this into account, I would also like to extend the question to the distinguished panelists on how do you see the role of social partners and civil society in the preparatory process to the World Social Summit, but also in its follow-up. I would also like to bring a second point, namely on social justice. So, social justice and combating social exclusion are fundamental aims enshrined in the treaties on the European Union. We continue promoting the social agenda as part of the integrated approach of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. We believe that social justice is essential to universal and lasting peace. There is a strong interdependence between social justice, social development, and the fulfillment of human rights on the one hand, and peace and security on the other. And I would like to follow up also to the intervention from the International Labour Organization on the role of Global Coalition for Social Justice. We understand that there should be an important role of this coalition contributing to the summit, but also if you could elaborate a little bit on how do you see the role of the coalition also in the follow-up to the summit. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, European Union, for your question. And I hope the following speakers will follow your example and give questions and comments rather than statements. Let me move on to Chile, followed by the Islamic Republic of Iran. Chile, please.
Señor Presidente. Chair, distinguished delegations, UN representatives, delegates, colleagues. I'm honored to talk to you about the Regional Conference on Social Development in Latin America and the Caribbean, and especially as president of this body. The Second World Summit on Social Development is an opportunity to make new commitments and to advance in light of the structural issues that we're facing. Latin America and the Caribbean continues to be one of the most unequal regions in the world. There has been progress in the reduction of poverty and access to basic services. However, inequality persists as a structural barrier that limits the full exercise of rights and deepens social exclusion. This situation continues to strike with greater force, especially affecting women and Afro-descendant and indigenous populations. Recent crises have revealed the fragility of our social protection systems and also the need to move towards more inclusive and sustainable models. In light of this, our region has built a roadmap that reaffirms that sustainable development should be the central axis of our strategies for growth and well-being. At the Regional Conference on Social Development in October 2023 in Santiago de Chile, we agreed on the need to strengthen institutions and to strengthen territorial access to close the gap in opportunities and access. At the regional conference in November last year in Barbados, we also shored up the regional consensus on moving towards universal, sustainable, resilient social protection systems. In this regard, one of the axes that we want to highlight at the Second World Summit is the centrality of care as an essential pillar for social well-being and economic development. Recent crises have highlighted issues in Latin America and the Caribbean disproportionately affecting women who take up a large proportion of the unpaid care work. Care should be a right, and this is key for well-being, social well-being and progress. Another area is guaranteeing social protection systems that are not just universal, but are actually designed to address the challenges, both of the present and the future. The Regional Conference on Sustainable Development has underscored that responses to challenges should be based on a comprehensive analysis. We cannot continue to look only at redistribution of income. We must have progressive policies and approaches investing in education and healthcare and consolidate pension systems that guarantee security without generating greater exclusion. We should have more effective and more coordinated leadership, strengthening the capacity of states in order to guarantee the effective implementation of these strategies. This meeting summit is an essential opportunity to discuss the challenges and commitments and to ensure that these are reflected in the political declaration at the summit. Our region will bring a clear message. Social development cannot continue to be a secondary goal in the global agenda. It must be recognized as a driver of inclusive growth, democratic stability, and social peace. At the regional conference, we reaffirmed our commitment to this process and to building a global compact that can shore up transformative social policies. There is no time for fragmentary policies and piecemeal policies. Thank you.
Thank you, Chere. The Islamic Republic of Iran, followed by Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Thank you to panelists for their valuable and fruitful interventions. Based on, I don't want to deliver any statement, just a question. Based on the lesson learned from the Copenhagen Summit, addressing this question is very important for my delegation. Without access to adequate and sufficient financial resources and update technology, achieving set goals and commitments and ensuring justice wouldn't be possible. We should think about the mechanism. What mechanism will be in place to ensure and evaluate the implementation of the goals and commitments of the Qatar High-Level Summit? It's very important. Thank you.
Thank you for a very important question. And we have the ongoing third meeting of the Preparatory Committee on Financing for Development. And we need to bring these strands together, and I hope panelists will have answers for you. Let me now invite Brazil, followed by UN Habitat. If they have a question, please don't issue a statement, because we have system already talking on social development. Brazil.
Thank you. I also don't have a statement. My question is directed to Mr. Rodrigo from CEPAL. I would like to thank you for the very complete calendar provided until we reach Doha, and also for the inputs. I think we're going to be discussing those topics on a daily basis from now on. My question is, how do you see the role of the integration regional processes in the region achieving the SDGs, achieving those goals until we reach new commitments to Doha? Thank you.
Thank you so much for your very targeted question for the region. Our colleagues from UN Habitat.
We don't really have a question, but we were going to just call for action for the developing community to consider seriously housing crisis to be addressed in the Social Summit Declaration. Thank you.
Thank you. So housing and urbanization both, right? Thank you so much. That's also your issue, and it's a major issue when it comes to Africa. So let me now invite another parts of the world as well, Africa, because the rate of urbanization is very high without any planning on the side of local authorities. Let me now go to NGOs. It's Human Rights Now, followed by Global Organization for Sustainable Development Goals, Inc., and then Children and Youth in this order. Human Rights Now. Please be brief. We have a presentation from Africa coming.
Thank you. I will focus just solely on the questions. The UN Charter opens with "We the Peoples," but the Second World Social Summit, will it be open to the people to participate in? While the First World Social Summit in 1995 was widely known as the People's Summit, right now, we don't know the degree to which civil society will actually be allowed to engage in the actual summit. Do you have any context on this? This leads me to my second question. Civil society must be included not only in the summit itself, but in the development of the outcome documents of the summit. My question, will member states include civil society in the Food for Thought paper consultations in March 2025 with quote-unquote stakeholders, in addition to the continuous consultations from April through July? And lastly, I cannot emphasize enough, member states who choose to host summits rooted in human rights and social development must actually live up to the commitments established during the summits. My question, how can we ensure that host countries to summits fully implement the commitments that we are establishing at these summits? Thank you.
Thank you so much. The questions are more addressed to the member states than to the panelists. So we'll open the floor for replies. Global Organization for Sustainable Development Goals, Inc., please.
My name is Valerie Reynoso, and I'm the United Nations Permanent Representative and Ambassador of the Global Organization for Sustainable Development Goals, which is a New York-based nonprofit organization that is committed to strengthening all forms of solidarity, social inclusion, and cohesion. Our commitments align with addressing the emerging issues here of social resilience and social development, vital to the goals of the World Summit, because we prioritize mitigating climate change effects in alignment with the Sustainable Development Goals. The United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs identified infrastructure asset management as a key challenge for improving state capacity and achieving the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. We believe that innovative smart city technologies can improve infrastructure asset management processes through adoptions of climate resilience enhancing digital monitoring systems. Smart city technologies can provide data to empower subnational asset managers, creating strategic lifecycle management plans. We recommend that member states further explore data ownership as a potential revenue source regarding public assets while considering privacy concerns and implement smart information management systems with assets. These can become new revenue streams for infrastructure asset management in adherence to the Paris Agreement and the United Nations Charter Article 55, subsection A. Given all this, we would like to know your thoughts on these proposals. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Children and Youth International, please focus on your question. No statements, please.
My name is Arpan, representing Children and Youth International. It is an honor to speak here today. As we're gathered here, I want to ask, as we assess the progress since the Copenhagen Declaration, we must ask, are we truly building a world where no one is left behind? The 1995 World Summit for Social Development took place before many of the young people in this room were born. And as we progress to the second Social Summit, I want to ask, what will we commit to turning promises into concrete actions, and what steps are we willing to take with the youth to build a future where social development is not just a promise, but a reality for all? Thank you.
Thank you so much for keeping it short. So, distinguished delegates, we fortunately now have a speaker from the Economic Commission for Africa, and the chair has agreed to invite them. Mr. Abu Bakri Dia, he is the Chief of Staff of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, to give you the regional perspective from Africa on social development. Mr. Dia, you have the microphone, please.
Thank you, moderator. So on behalf of CSocD63, I wanted to mention that he was in a meeting with the Secretary General and the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, so that's why he couldn't join you directly. So I will read his statement. Excellencies, distinguished panelists, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it's a privilege to join you today for this critical dialogue on the Second World Summit for Social Development. I wish to begin by extending my gratitude to the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs for convening this discussion as such a defining moment in our global trajectory. 30 years ago, the Copenhagen Declaration laid the foundation for a world in which social development would be central to sustainable progress. Despite decades of economic growth in many regions, deep and persistent inequalities remain. Conflict, climate disasters, and economic disruptions continue to exacerbate vulnerabilities, leaving millions on the margins of society. And nowhere is this more evident than in Africa, where 55% of global extreme poverty is concentrated, with almost 500,000 million people struggling with to meet the basic needs. The urgency for action has therefore never been greater. We must act and act decisively. Over the past year, has conducted extensive consultations across the continent with policymakers, civil society, the private sector, and development partners to craft programmatic solutions. Out of these discussions have emerged 5 core priorities that must be central to the summit's outcomes. First, we must eradicate extreme poverty and inequality through scalable social protection. Africa's persistent poverty and rising inequality demand radical and comprehensive social protection measures. Today, only 17.4% of Africa's population receives at least one social protection benefit, a figure that is far below the global average of 47%. This is unacceptable. To ensure the summit's impact, we must champion universal social protection floors, target cash transfer programs, and innovative financing mechanisms that integrate informal workers into structured safety nets. Second, we must transform employment and skills development for Africa's youth. By 2050, Africa's youth population will surge to 1 billion. Yet, today, 23% of Africa's young people remain outside education, employment, or training. If we are to realize the promises of the Pact for the Future, then we must bridge the gap between education and industry through investment in technical and vocational education trainings, digital literacy, and entrepreneurial support systems. A workforce equipped with future-ready skills is indispensable to Africa. Third, we must build inclusive and resilient economies through structural transformation. Our economies must transition from resource dependency to diversified value-added industries. In this regard, the African Continental Free Trade Area presents an unprecedented opportunity to develop regional value chain and manufacturing, agriculture, and services. For this to materialize, the summit must reinforce policies that promote industrialization, reduce trade barriers, and accelerate investments in infrastructure and digital connectivity. Fourth, we must invest in human capital through quality healthcare and education. Health and education are twin pillars of social development. Yet today in Africa, only 10% of children can read a simple text by age 10. Meanwhile, over 70% of countries lack a skilled health workforce. The summit must therefore advocate for increased investments in universal healthcare, early childhood education, and gender-responsive policies, the glaring education and health gap. A continent's future is only as strong as the well-being of its people. And finally, we must strengthen regional and global partnerships for sustainable development. No nation can stand alone, and no challenge is insurmountable when we work together. Addressing today's social challenges requires unprecedented coordination and collaboration. For this reason, the ECA continues to work closely with African UN agencies and regional economic communities to forge an inclusive and sustainable development agenda. And the summit must emphasize innovative financing, South-South cooperation, and private sector engagement to drive sustainable change. Distinguished colleagues, as we prepare for the second World Summit for Social Development, we must ensure that the political declaration is not just a reaffirmation of past commitments, but a bold and actionable roadmap for transformative change. In this regard, I call upon all stakeholders to establish a global social compact that guarantees minimum social protection for all. It is imperative that we invest in skills development and future-ready jobs for Africa's young workforce. It is also crucial that we ensure inclusive financing mechanisms that leave no one behind. And we must strengthen multilateral cooperation to tackle emerging social challenges from climate resilience to digital inclusion. The world is watching. The success of the summit will be measured by the tangible improvements in the lives of billions. And the ECA remains committed to work with you to achieve a more dignified world for all. I thank you for your kind attention.
Mr. Roth, thank you so much for your clear priorities and stepping in at the last minute to bring African perspective. Our discussion would have been incomplete without listening to the African challenges, because the youngest continent with the highest number of young people, how do we make sure, and hunger and poverty challenges are very acute. On top of that, climate shocks Africa's challenges require special attention at the World Summit on Social Development. We have one last speaker from the floor, then we come back to the panel. Chair, sorry, we're already exceeding time limit, but the discussion is becoming interesting now. So Burkina Faso has the microphone, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Moderateur.
Thank you, moderator, sir, ladies and gentlemen. We are preparing for the second World Summit on Social Development. We need to take stock of the progress made since the Copenhagen Summit. Burkina Faso has made progress in enshrining the Copenhagen principles. We have sought to bolster our social welfare mechanisms, helping the informal workforce and vulnerable households. We've sought to help access to credit, especially for young people and women. We've sought to consolidate peace and integrate people affected by conflict into resilience programs. We would suggest that the second summit gives us the opportunity to renew our strong commitment for innovative, sustainable financing in order to guarantee resilient social policies, to set up a more robust framework for implementing international commitments, with more transparent accountability mechanisms, to take into consideration new challenges such as the digital divide, migration, climate change, and adapting educational systems. Burkina Faso is actively participating in the preparations for the World Summit and is calling for collective mobilization for fairer, inclusive social development. Thank you very much.
Thank you, distinguished delegate from Burkina Faso. Let me come back to the panelists. With your permission, I could start in the reverse order. I can begin with Rodrigo, because he also had a specific question from his region. Rodrigo, over to you.
Thank you very much, Navid. I would like to comment the question from Brazil. I would say that the different instances of regional integration has been part of the discussion in Latin America and the Caribbean. This has been a key issue that we have highlighted as the most important in terms of institutional development in the region. This is not just at the regional level, but at sub-regional also. And I would like to highlight the work of Mercosur Social, the Integrational Secretary of Social in Central America, and the CARICOM, and the CELAC that gets all the countries working together. So this has been key, and we understand this is important for the development, for social development in the region. We think that we won't have real inclusive social development if we are not going all together, not just at the same path, at the same level, but following the same path in terms of the objectives and some of the policies. This does not mean that this is easy, but this is the issue that we attempt to work in the regional conference on social development in terms of bringing all the views together. Has been good, but it doesn't mean that will be sufficient for the future. And just to add, for the other comments, I would like to comment on civil society and participation. We think that this is key for the discussion. This is a matter of sustainability, but also of recognition and a matter of rights. So civil society participation, it would be very important in the process and what happened after. And regarding the issue of what happened after the summit, we have talked about will we wait for another 30 years for the third summit on social development? Or we can think, according to some of the comments that have been said before, of having a more frequent review of the process like this, but also in another arena of discussion with countries and with more view, as we have in the economic dimension or in environmental dimension. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me go now to Mr. Srinivas. Tata Srinivas, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. I think I'll just be brief. The first comment is about how do we ensure the participation of civil society in a real manner, in a way that really makes a difference. I think the multi-stakeholder aspect is integral to Copenhagen, and it is, I think, integral. Also, it is recognized in the multi-stakeholder, in the modalities resolution, and all our preparatory meetings that we are planning are multi-stakeholder in nature. We are trying to get in, I mean, I think we are bringing in civil society to contribute to the discussions, and we hope that what we put up as views, and it's not an agreed outcome document because we know that is going to be negotiated here. But in terms of Asia Pacific, we are trying to get views cutting across the different stakeholders, but perhaps culling out what are the key messages from our region that could inform the global discussions. And we hope that this will be truly something that distills inputs from all the different sections. And I believe that we have set an example in a number of our meetings which address social development, whether it be the Beijing Platform for Action, MIPA, or whether it be recently concluded the regional review of GCM. Many countries are responding in our region by including CSOs in their delegations. Civil society are part of national delegations in many cases. Plus, we are having stakeholder consultations which actually feed in. And in fact, some of the stakeholder consultations invite member states as part of the last part of the agenda to brief them about the outcomes. So this is happening in many ways, and it should happen in a stronger manner, we believe. I would like to just focus on one more issue of intergenerational relations. The fact that, look, we need to take into account the views of youth. We need to really integrate them into the discussions. But I think we'd love to draw upon the wisdom that was provided by the Pact for future generations. In our region, I think we, for the first time, have significant proportions of older persons, youth, and you know, the different age groups living together in significant proportions for the first time because of the tremendous speed of aging. On the other hand, we have significant youth populations. I think building intergenerational solidarity is not a cliche anymore. It's important. There are many ways this interaction happens. It is not a zero-sum game. I think it's a win-win situation if you can really implement the intergenerational relations and promote them concretely. The fact is, in the future, we need to understand that the future belongs to all generations, and each generation can learn. Older generations need to leave a better future for younger generations, and the younger generations have a lot to benefit in terms of learning also from the older generation. So intergenerational relations has to be a very strong feature, I believe, of this summit, considering the demographic change that is not only sweeping Asia Pacific, but other regions too. Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you so much, Srinivas. Let me move to Magdalena for your observations and replies, Magdalena.
Thank you very much. I am also going to respond to the question about the participation of civil society of the European Union. The modality resolution talks about inclusive and participatory process. And we have seen how, and the examples provided in this panel, how the economic commissions, as well as other UN entities, including UNRIS, have been stepping in and taking forward and realizing this inclusive consultation. But there is much more that needs to be done. So I think that the summit provides an opportunity to states to carry out national consultations towards the social summit. They state have the opportunity to bring the voices of their own citizens regarding what they think are the challenges and put those challenges into the table, including after a process of consultation, including them in their delegations. Then very briefly on the monitoring and evaluation of the summit, I think that this is very important. We cannot continue creating summits that are not follow-up or are follow-up only after 30 years. So it makes a very strong call for including in the political declaration concrete follow-up mechanism. Some creativity is needed, but some ideas is include post-summit regular meetings, include data collection and national analytical reports that can be monitored and in order to assess progress towards the realization of the commitment. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Magdalena. And Laura, you have a specific question from the EU on Coalition for Social Justice. And any other issues you would like to comment, you're welcome to do that.
Thank you, Navid. And thank you. I think we all agree with the analysis, and I think that we are all convinced that we need to bring a human-centered approach to sustainable development and to social development. So I think we need to focus on how to do that during the summit, and what responses and outcomes can we try to achieve. I will briefly talk about skills. I think skills, everybody agreed that is a big problem, and access to lifelong learning is fundamental in that process. We need to connect the skills with also the digital skills and try to avoid the divide that we are going to have between the South and the North, but also between men and women. So this is, I think, a very important element that needs to be addressed, and I hope governments are going to be proactive on that. Inequalities, obviously, is the other thing that needs to be addressed. And there are a number of solutions that exist. They are not miracle solutions. They need a comprehensive plan. Nonetheless, there are some elements that we are proposing, like the living wages, that will contribute to reduce inequalities in the world of work, at least. Transition from informality to formality is something that is fundamental, and there are a number also of measures that need to be taken in order to address that. Support to micro enterprises that are the biggest employers in the world. Extending social protection was mentioned by everybody, and we all agree that there has been progress, but the progress needs to continue to be strengthened, and obviously enforcing labor rights. Now, let me move to the specific question of the EU. Clearly, I think it is extremely important that, and it was mentioned just before, that the outcome of not only the preparation, the negotiation, but also the outcome of the summit has a multi-stakeholder component. Everybody has a role to play. There is not, governments have a fundamental role, but nonetheless, everybody else also has to contribute to this if we want to make it happen. So the idea with the Global Coalition is, because it is a platform that brings all actors together. The idea is that the Global Coalition can help identify the specific actions that need to be undertaken and try to be the platform that helps the implementation of these specific actions. Obviously, it's not going to be the only platform, but I think this is a very comprehensive platform that offers a great possibility of multi-stakeholder collaboration, and that is indeed focused on what we want to focus, that is social justice and social development. Thanks.
Thank you, Laura. Over to you, concluding remarks.
Thank you, Navid, and it's a very insightful and interesting discussions. Let me talk about some of my colleagues has talked about, and there was a concern about the consultations and civil society engagements. We at the regional commissions, and I can speak about my other regional commissions, we're doing our best to do consultations and using different forums and events to get consultations with various stakeholders. However, liquidity constraint and budget constraints and budget cuts will not allow us to have what we would like to have. The depth of our consultation will not be as we would like to. We're constrained with budgets, and the member states needs to be aware of that. Into it, and I'm frank on these things, but we will continue to do as much consultation as possible to have the voice of every single vulnerable group there is, and every single group in the society, in addition to governments, as much as we can. Second part is the issues that will be discussed on various issues, and I hope that 3 elements has to be taken care when we're talking about these issues are the availability, accessibility, and most importantly is the sustainability. When we're gonna get these solutions and ideas, please ensure, because of financing, and that's what we're talking about linking with financing, the sustainability of these issues and ideas, and not only having it, but they are accessible, but also they are sustainable. It doesn't make sense. I have a policies that is sustained for 1 year or 2 years, and then we have to revisit. So these 3 issues, I think, is extremely important. We're looking into different sides. And last, and I think all of us, we don't need more promises, we don't need more drafting resolutions, and I hope that social summit outcome comes with commitments that goes beyond the adoption of the political declaration. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very powerful ending by Rola. So, distinguished delegates, this is an unenviable task to summarize this conversation, so I won't even attempt to do that. But I just want to leave a few thoughts for your reflection as you prepare. First, I think a very clear message from the room and from the panelists. It's not just whole of government, but whole of society approach that will make this summit inclusive, impactful, and ensure effective follow-up. So member states are in the driver's seat, but the civil society is the compass, is the GPS to drive this process. So they have rules that should be protected, advanced in this conversation. Second, we have come a long way since Copenhagen, so we should give ourselves credit. But the challenges change in their nature and in their severity, especially after COVID. So we need to contextualize the social agenda for the current, both economic environment, financial conditions, and geopolitical tensions. So that's the second message clearly from this room. We are facing structural challenges, structural transformations, and old policies may not work. And that brings me to my third point, which I also heard in the ongoing discussion in the third session of the PrepCom for Financing for Development conference. Astute observation by one panelist, using the analogy, stop fighting yesterday's war. We keep on repeating same policy prescriptions, solutions. If they haven't worked, rethink, go back to the drawing board. The nature of challenges have changed. And demographic challenges weren't there in 1995. Temporal equity and dealing with these intergenerational relationships in societies may become a very important issue for many governments in the coming decades. So we also need to stop fighting yesterday's war, think of new policy tools, think of new coalitions, new solutions that may be designed for the current context. So I think approaching this summit, we need to go with an open mind, inclusion, and solutions that will eventually impact and advance these goals, which are, I think, critical to give hope to young people and build trust in societies. Trust within a society is largely dependent on achievement of social goals and delivery of social services. That's where citizens trust a government when it responds to their immediate needs and plans for the coming generation's needs. So thank you, Chair, for the opportunity to be part of this very engaging conversation and bringing diversity of views and perspectives and highlighting the complexity of social development, which cannot be simplified in one conversation. But may I request you a round of applause for our panelists? They have done a great job. Thank you so much.
we have reached the end of an interesting interactive dialogue with senior officials of the UN system, and I thank Mr. Hanif for guiding our discussion. I also thank our panelists and delegations for their participation and contribution. The Commission has thus concluded its program of work for this meeting. Before adjourning this meeting, I would like to remind delegations that the Commission will continue its consideration of the item 3A to hold the multi-stakeholders forum this afternoon at 3 p.m. The meeting is adjourned.